Hello again, YouTube. I promised I'd make a video when I got the user interface working on my assembler. But the main reason I'm making this video is that I'll be taking a break from working on this project for a while. So I figured this would be the best time to show the progress. Hopefully I can work in the dark here. The editor and the assembler now work seamlessly together, and the user interface for the assembler is functionally complete. Unfortunately, the user interface for the editor is non-existent. I'd like to have a main menu where you can select what you're doing. Like right now, I'm loading that file, but I guess if you didn't warn me, you probably wouldn't guess that. Uh, Today is 23, I think. I guess what I should do though before I go ahead and assemble the assembler, I'll do that at the end of the video. I'm going to demonstrate how the editor and the assembler work together with some garbage code here. Now the reason I'm using garbage code is to demonstrate what happens when you do have an error. I'll save this and assemble it. Now the editor is handing off to the assembler, and it's basically going to tell me that I've got gibberish in my instruction on that line that I just edited by sending me back to the editor and placing the cursor on that line. Now I guess that was a bad demonstration because it looks like the cursor is just right where I left off, so I'll put the cursor over here and do it again. And there you go. Now I'll comment out that bad line. So looking at this right now, there are no bad lines. There's nothing in this file that will cause a problem. But what we'll see here shortly, okay, that didn't help. Test 2 might not exist. What I was hoping to show off is that the editor will open this file and place the cursor on the line in there. And I'm probably running into another bug here. Sometimes when the assembler passes back to the editor, I must have a bad stack pointer because things get corrupt. And that's something I have to work on. So let's try this again. Maybe I was running into corrupted memory there. I probably should have started over from scratch. Obviously something is corrupted. something in the operating system, because you should not be seeing those words. But here we are in the other file. That's the include file, referenced by the main file. And there you can see the cursor is on the line with the invalid instruction. So even though the computer is not doing exactly what it's supposed to here, the software does work mostly. Of course, the reason the computer is not working right is because the software is corrupting it. And now, as always, the ultimate proof that the assembler is working correctly is by assembling the assembler. And of course, you'll get to see the user interface for the assembler working a little bit more. Now, this is not to say that the assembler is bug-free. Just because it assembles the code for itself doesn't mean that it catches all problems with the code. There's at least a few things that probably aren't accounted for right now, and frankly, there's a lot of things I'm not even going to find, because I know my style of code so well that I'm not going to deviate from it. And what I would really need at that point, and probably could use already, is some alpha testers, just to try to use the software and run into the problems that I'm not going to run into. But for the most part, everything is working. Like I say, I have to fix the editor. There's quite a bit of bugs in the editor, actually, and you may have seen one earlier, not even realized it. There's times when the cursor position within the file stays correct, but the cursor position on the screen moves. This is a problem that I had solved several years ago, but I seem to have lost the version of the code where I solved that problem, so I'm going to have to go back and do that again, which is not the end of the world. And of course, like I said, I really need to have some kind of menu in the editor, so that instead of the way it is now, it's very cryptic. You can push a key here and there and things happen, but unless you are well versed in how to operate the software, and I won't be in a couple of years if I put this away and don't work on it again. I'll have to read the code to figure out how to use my own editor again. But having a menu that displays when you run the editor without loading a file, I think will improve that greatly. And of course, the assembler here runs significantly faster than it ever did in the past. But there's a long way to go. The code in the assembler is very sloppy. Code in the editor is very sloppy. In a lot of cases, I cobbled together something quickly just to get it working so that I could work on something else. And so there's a lot of refinement that I could do. But this was the important part, just making everything work to the point where it's usable. And after this, then I can go back and optimize. The assembler itself is very large, so it's easy to get the impression here that it's just terribly slow. The fact of the matter is there's a very large amount of code here, and I've lost track of how much there is because I've separated it into all of these separate files to make it more manageable. I think you'll see when it completes that it assembles into just over 2,000 lines of code. I'm not exactly certain of that. It's some number over 2,000. The point being, if I did not comment my code, if I did not format it in a legible way, it would be around that number of lines. But of course, for other reasons, it's quite larger than what the assembled code actually is. And what that line number on the target file, which you'll see here when we get into pass2, what that depicts is if you were to disassemble the code very strictly, that's how many lines you would see in the assembled code. I guess that probably doesn't make sense unless you're familiar with this style of assembly language. Here we are on the second pass. So we're halfway done. Now, of course, it takes a little bit longer to do the second pass than the first pass because we are writing to the disk, and the majority of the time spent in the assembler here is reading and writing to and from the disk. Of course, I'm using a 1541 disk drive, which is terribly slow, and there's no good way around that without modifying the drive or using some other hardware. And I have not done that up to this point intentionally. I don't want to get to a point where I'm writing software that only works on my hardware. Now, the setup that I'm using right now is nothing more than a Commodore 64, a 1541 disk drive, and this 1702 monitor, which the monitor is inconsequential. There are other disk drives, and of course you could use a Commodore 128 or whatever, but this is very typical setup. Anybody can obtain a setup exactly like this. And of course, that's what I like to target my software at. I could also greatly speed up things by using a RAM expansion. As Commodore put it, an REU, RAM expansion unit. I could probably load everything into the RAM expansion unit, quick do the assembly, and then write everything back to disk at some time in the future. Now, the idea there would be if you're debugging, and hopefully you don't crash the computer to the point where you lose the REU contents, you could go back and forth between the editor and the assembler and never access the disk until you get to the point where you want to actually write everything to the disk when you're done. But RAM expansion units, REUs, are not terribly common. They are obtainable, but I think at this point in history, they're getting harder to. I can't even show it here. They're getting harder to obtain, and they're only going to get harder and more expensive to obtain unless somebody comes up with some kind of affordable aftermarket solution, and that's going to be hard to achieve because you'd have to make enough of them probably to sell to most Commodore 64 users to be worthwhile, and most Commodore 64 users are not going to want to buy something like that. The unexpanded machine does what most people want to do, loading commercial software and mostly playing games. Now I've got some other ideas about mass storage devices, things I have wanted to do for decades, and ways that I know I can implement them. It's just a matter of taking the time to do it. And of course, before I even embark on a project like that, I'm going to research do a lot of research and make sure I'm doing it the right way. Even though I've been thinking about these things for a long time, uh, it's not that I've got all the right ideas yet. Something else I haven't done yet is give any indication of success. Basically, when this is done, it's going to pass back to the editor and not give any indication of what happened. Now, obviously, it's not going to indicate any kind of fault, so you can assume that everything assembled complete. But there's nothing that indicates that otherwise. Something else I'd like to work on is at least clearing the screen before going back to the editor. You'll see here very shortly that the handover from the assembler to the editor is graphically kind of ugly. And there you have it, 2,439 lines of assembled code. And here we are back in the editor, and like I say, it's back to the main file with no indication of success, which of course it was successful. Now, another annoying part of this is, let's say I was working in one of these include files and I wanted to assemble the project right now, because I don't have any means to do so on the editor. I would have to load the main file here and assemble from here. There's no way, otherwise I would be assembling the include file. And of course, in most cases that won't work because I defined my instruction set here in the main file. But like I say, that's one of the things that when I get the editor really really presentable, that's going to be one of the changes. You will have a defined main project that you're working on, which will always be the file that gets sent to the assembler rather than what you're currently working on. And there you have it. I will run the assembler manually here just to show that it did assemble correctly. Only because in my last video I failed at that. I could only find a disk handy with a version of the assembler where I was writing the new user interface. And because I didn't start with the editor here, I had to manually type in the file I want to assemble. That's intentional, and it's always going to be that way. I'd like to have this run independently or from the editor. I think that's advantageous both ways. I don't want the editor and the assembler to be completely tied together and inseparable. The idea there is maybe somebody has their own editor they would like to use, and that way they're not restricted to using my editor. But there you have it. I'm not going to continue this video to the end of the assembly here, because all we're doing is watching the same thing all over again. But what that demonstrates, what I couldn't demonstrate the last time, is that the assembler successfully assembles itself in a way that works. But there you have it. Like I say, it's going to be I'm going to be taking some time off from working on this. It's functionally complete, but not aesthetically complete, and not fully debugged. But this is the way it's going to be until I get working on it again, which I guess I could start up again at any point. But it's going to be at least at least a few days before I look at the code again. So there you have it. Thank you for watching, and hopefully you could bear to watch the whole 20 minutes. And I apologize for being long and boring again here, but unfortunately, that's the nature of these things. So there you have it.